Hello everyone, welcome to the 8th module. We're going to check out vulnerability management. Now if you're new here, do yourself a favor and subscribe, and also maybe save this playlist so that you can find the rest of the videos and the future ones a bit more easily. For those of you who are returning, welcome back. So let's get into the vulnerability management, and the first section we're going to tackle is the device and operating system vulnerabilities. Let's start out with some low-hanging fruit, the operating system vulnerabilities. And of course, all operating systems are going to have vulnerabilities. Remember, a vulnerability is a weakness in how something was made. Generally, it occurs through a bug in programming or something similar to that. Now, sadly, we will never be able to eliminate all vulnerabilities on our computers, never mind our operating systems, as to have some functionality means there needs to be some form of access, and that could always be exploited. However, every operating system family is going to have its own unique set of vulnerability types. For instance, Windows client operating systems are generally going to be prone to malware and exploits that revolve around the sheer variety of applications and use case scenarios that the users of a Windows personal computer are going to be putting their machines through. So you're always going to have that challenge. Then with Windows Server, you're also going to have a certain set of vulnerabilities. As both the client and the server version of the operating system both have a lot of the same core programming, a lot of the malware designed for Windows client can potentially work on a Windows server. Thankfully though, at least the graphical user interface is usually not included on Windows Server by default. If you just click your way through the installation wizard of Windows Server, and it's been like this since Server 2012, it'll install with no graphical user interface. You'll just have command prompt that you can elevate to PowerShell. Then you have Apple's macOS. Despite what Apple and the Apple fans will tell you, macOS is an operating system, just like any other, and can also have vulnerabilities and weaknesses in it. Thankfully though, because Apple's environment is a closed ecosystem, it is their hardware, it is their software, and as long as you stick to their app store, it is also their platform for distributing software that they have validated. This makes it easier for Apple to identify the vulnerabilities in macOS and patch them out reasonably quickly. Then of course you've got Linux, and Linux can actually be a bit of a pain in the backside when it comes to security. In some ways, yes, it is more secure than Windows. For instance, malware generally doesn't do very well in the Linux ecosystem, as there's so much variety amongst all of the distributions, and you can go and customize your chosen distribution at a very deep and fundamental level, which gives you a huge amount of choice and gives the attacker an inconsistent target for malware. However, where Linux does suffer is that sheer variety. You are more likely to encounter configuration issues as well as potential remote access vulnerabilities, which is a very common weakness in a lot of Linux machines. But thankfully, it's not all gloom and doom. We are going to talk about remediation later in this video, so hold on for that. And also, it's always worth remembering that you can do a really good job securing what should be a bad operating system from a security perspective, and a terrible job at deploying and securing what should be a good and secure OS. So it's not just always, oh, what operating system are you using? It's how well has it been set up. Then we have Android. Now with Android, you are dealing with a similar challenge to the Linux space. And no, it's not because Android is based on Linux. It's because Google releases AOSP, or Android Open Source Project. And it's up to the handset manufacturers of the smartphones and tablets and whatnot that run Android to take Android and modify it in two key ways. The first is to make sure it runs smoothly on their hardware. The second way they modify it is also to give the user a unique experience. That is why you'll see that Android is a little different when you go from one Android phone to another. It's mainly aimed at keeping the non-technical customers locked into that particular Android handset's ecosystem. Speaking of locking into an ecosystem, iOS. iOS also has its own interesting set of vulnerabilities that we will look at just now. But before I get too carried away, let's talk about some interesting use case based vulnerabilities. Now, this is how a system gets acquired or deployed or supported that can have an interesting effect on the vulnerabilities that you will have to deal with. And first on the firing line is legacy systems. Now, legacy systems, just for clarification purposes, are unsupported environments, whether it be hardware, software, applications, whatever. It is out of date. The vendor who created it is no longer releasing patches, updates, advisories, or anything like that. When a system goes legacy and you continue to use it, you are solely responsible for the security of said system. You are also responsible for dealing with vulnerabilities and potential exploitation. Now, it's not all bad if and only if your organization follows the best practices when it comes to legacy systems, which is you support legacy while you're buying yourself time to migrate towards a up-to-date and supported solution. However, many organizations will look at a supported legacy system and say, yeah, it's still working, leave it be. And then it gets more and more challenging as every year passes, as more and more vulnerabilities and weaknesses are discovered. But let's move on from legacy to end-of-life systems. Now, when you are talking about end-of-life, there are actually a couple stages of how a particular solution is terminated. Usually, you'll get an end-of-marketing date where that particular product is no longer going to be advertised or actively encouraged to be bought by the customer. Then you will get to end of sale, where no more of that device may be sold. Any unsold goods either have to be destroyed or returned to the original vendor. And then you finally get EOL, where you're not going to get any more updates, no more support, stuff like that. Now, the reason why we bring this up is because it does happen that you might pick up on a new piece of kit, a new piece of software, or something like that just before it reaches the end of marketing. And the salespeople are pushing to get that thing out while they're still allowed to market it. So whenever you are looking at acquiring a new product or a new service, especially from a vendor you're not familiar with, check the support dates. And if no support dates are available, see what their historical behavior has been like when it comes to retirement, just to give yourself a bit of an idea. Then you also get firmware vulnerabilities. Now, the good news about firmware vulnerabilities is they don't happen too often, but when they do happen, they can be quite catastrophic, and they will affect the system regardless of the operating system you have running on it. If you like, you can go and read up a little bit more about the Spectre and the Meltdown vulnerabilities. Both were taking advantage of how certain generations of CPUs from both Intel and AMD had a weakness in their pre-processing of data. But I'll let you go read up on that. It's quite interesting. But it does highlight how catastrophic a firmware vulnerability can be. And in some cases, the original manufacturer of the hardware may not release a patch that addresses that firmware vulnerability. And there is only so much that an operating system or application update could do to fix that. Then, as virtualization and cloud computing are so popular nowadays, let's also consider that virtualization can have some weaknesses. Some of the most concerning vulnerabilities would be to do with things like VM escape conditions, which is where an operation in a virtual machine can potentially escape the virtual boundaries of that VM and possibly affect other VMs, or worse yet, the host running them. This is obviously a concern. Another concern as well is potential exploits in the hypervisor and its administration console. As if I can control how the VMs run, I can control your operations that are hosted in the cloud. Then you've got application-induced vulnerabilities. They might say, but isn't that just normal, having an application and it creates a vulnerability because of the application? Yes, that does happen. But in this case, what we're looking at is where an installed application creates a vulnerability in something else, like the operating system or possibly the firmware. and that vulnerability would not be present if it were not for that particular application. So you do get an interesting relationship there. In general, when people talk about application vulnerabilities, they're normally talking about the app itself being vulnerable, not the app introducing a vulnerability onto the system. But let's talk about one of the scariest kinds of vulnerabilities you can get, a zero-day vulnerability. Let's check this out. What makes it a zero-day? Well, the hacking community discovers the vulnerability first, and they weaponize it. They develop exploits, and they begin using those zero-day exploits on target organizations. Essentially, the developers have 0 days head start on fixing the issue. If the developers working for the vendor discovered it first, or the customer discovered it and reported it to the vendor, or an independent security researcher discovered it first and reported it to the vendor, there'd be a head start on the release of a patch or at least a hotfix to address the issue. And what makes this truly scary is that most anti-malware solutions, whether they be simple antiviruses or fancy endpoint protection platforms, security information event management tools, vulnerability scanners, etc., they're all ineffective, especially if they are signature based, as there is no signature to rely upon here in most cases. The only bit of good news for you is that attackers do risk 0 days being discovered the more they use them. So the really powerful 0 days will often be reserved for high value targets so that the full impact and benefit is felt by the attacker. Now, if this sounds a bit scary to you and you're like, oh my lord, how am I going to keep up with this? Well, I've got a useful piece of advice for you. I have a Google News alert set up on my Gmail account. And what happens is anything that's got the term 0 day in all permeations, 0 day vulnerabilities, 0 day attacks, 0 day exploits, etc., gives me a Google News alert. And what I do is I have a quick look at the headlines and I check to see, okay, is this recently discovered 0 day vulnerability or exploit something that is going to affect what I'm using? If it doesn't affect me and my organization, I'm not going to worry about that problem today. I will obviously have it on my radar so that I'm aware of it. Security intelligence is always useful, but I'm not going to lose sleep over it. I'll worry when it is a 0 day that does affect me and my organization. Then I will definitely react to that more accordingly. And it might sound a bit callous, but that's the way the world is, I'm afraid. I can't worry about every 0 day, and I'm definitely not going to spend time worrying about a 0 day that doesn't affect me. At least not immediately. But let's look at one of my favorite types of vulnerabilities, as they can often be fixed just with a little bit of hard work and self-improvement. Misconfiguration vulnerabilities. A bad setup can be all that's needed for an attacker to get into what should have been a fairly good and secure system. So what kind of misconfigs do we want to watch out for? Well, the list is almost endless, but some of the big names will be having a bad default configuration sitting on the machine. Now, sometimes you do get some good defaults when it comes to security, but if the default is a bad default, then obviously it's going to lead to everything else being vulnerable. Also, attackers know default values, which means it's a lot easier for them to compromise your security when it relies on default details. Now, this will apply not just to your operating system, but your hardware. Any software you're running, as I said, including your operating system, any services that run on the OS, and obviously applications as well. You need to watch out for any point where a misconfiguration could pop up. Now, where does that self-improvement I mentioned fit in here? Well, normally the administrators and professionals deploying these systems could probably do with a little bit more education in the security implications of the choices they're making. So if they learn a bit more, they can implement a bit more. They can become more effective. So that is always an option. But one you do need to be mindful of are cloud services. They can be a little bit harder to track down bad defaults because not everything is going to be viewable to you as the cloud consumer, unless you are running your own private cloud, in which case, well, virtualization vulnerabilities are your problem here. And another thing you want to watch out for when it comes to bad config is when you mindlessly have people following guides and solutions and tutorials that they come across on the internet, especially when troubleshooting. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that you must never Google, DuckDuckGo, Yahoo, Bing, whatever search engine you prefer, your problems. The idea here is that when you're looking at the guide, when you're looking at the solution to a particular problem, that you think and consider what's the implication on the security by the end of it. When people mindlessly follow the instructions and then stuff works, they're probably not going to go back and review the security to make sure that they haven't made the system inadvertently weak somehow. And another problem that comes along and often causes this habit of just following the instructions to get the thing working is the get it working now mindset. That occurs not just in troubleshooting, but also in system deployments, where a lot of pressure might be put on the team to get the thing up and running, to get it working, and don't worry, we'll secure it later. But the problem is, if that's how the initial deployment went, I bet you they're not going to make time for a security cycle, because sometimes that can be seen as a financial waste. So we must be careful. Just because we want to get it working ASAP doesn't mean we should compromise on the cybersecurity here. Then, what about our cryptography? As I said when we covered the cryptography in a previous video, that encryption is not perfect, it's not bulletproof, there are ways around it. So let's see what some of the common vulnerabilities are. Well, poorly protected keys. As we know, the encryption and especially the decryption keys are super useful if the attacker gets their hands on it, as they don't have to spend a huge amount of time and computing resources trying to brute force and permeate every possible key. So what can be done to keep a key secure? Well, review the authentication and access controls used on the location on the system where the key is actually stored itself. Ideally, you want to make sure it's staff only, heavily secured, validated entry, stuff like that. Another thing to watch out for are not just poorly secured keys, but also weak cryptographic keys. Now, in a lot of cases, when you are setting up encryption, you normally type something. Now, that itself is not the cryptographic key. That is something we call the seed value. And if the seed value is not unique or random enough, that can lead to repetitions of the same key being used by 2 or more different people, which can be a bit of an issue. So whenever you are creating or typing in something to be used as the key, you're actually typing the seed value that generates the key. Regardless of how long the seed value is, it'll always make sure it fits the bit length of the key, which means that sometimes the key's got to be stretched. And the problem with stretching is normally the algorithm pads some zeros at the beginning or the end of the data, and that can lead to some predictability and repetition occurring within the cryptographic key, making it a little bit easier to perform cryptanalysis. Also, if you're running around with the same key for an extended period of time, I want you to think of it in a similar vein to how you should be treating your internet banking password. A very common issue is that people will use the same password day in, day out, year in, year out. And if you're using that same password, you're giving the attacker a stationary target to aim at, and they'll hit it eventually. Whereas if you keep changing your password on the regular, the attacker doesn't have a consistent target, it's always moving to an extent. And the same is true for cryptographic keys. Once in a while, you want to destroy the old key pair and generate a new one. That way, if subtly the previous key was ever compromised or intercepted somehow, it is a little harder for the information to be used against us. Then another major concern is having no key backups in case you ever lose the decryption key in your production system. Do yourself a favor, back up your decryption keys, or if the solution uses it, a recovery key, whichever makes the most sense, and keep that backup/recovery key secure. Another thing you also need to look at doing is implementing escrow. Escrow is where your data, especially in this case, your cryptographic keys, are kept with a trusted third party. This is useful for business relationships so that if you or I go out of business, our partners can come and get the keys for decrypting data from the escrow agent. Also, in some countries and jurisdictions, there might be a legal obligation for certain kinds of businesses and industries to actually escrow their decryption keys so that if law enforcement needs to, with a warrant obviously, they can intercept and decrypt the communications, basically being a 21st century version of tapping a telephone line. Another thing to also watch out for are old cryptographic cipher suites. Now, the reason why we must be careful about this is usually when it comes to encrypted network communications, the two parties that are going to communicate normally negotiate what's the best cryptographic cipher that both can manage. And in some situations, a really old OS, a really old version of the browser, or whatever, might not have the appropriate ciphers for more modern and effective security, and it might be holding back the other systems they're communicating with from using better and more sophisticated and elegant cryptographic solutions. So do yourself that favor and keep your operating system, your browser, and any other network-based application up to date, or manually install your own cipher suite and integrate it as you need to. Then moving on to mobile operating systems and their vulnerabilities. So iOS. iOS is pretty stable actually, but it's not perfect. One of the main hassles that I can guarantee every iOS user will run into at some point is that the old handset will have a limitation on the version it will support. Now, in fairness to Apple, there's a benefit to that. Apple limits older handsets from having the newer versions of iOS, as it'll be a degraded experience and the hardware just simply won't keep up. And I kind of respect that, because at least Apple's kind of saying to you, listen, if you're going to keep using this iPhone for years and years and years and years, it should at least work as smoothly and as quickly as it did roundabout when it was still new. So, fairness. But at some point, you're going to miss out on security updates. Your apps might not be able to update either beyond a certain version, especially if they're using something that's present in a newer version of iOS than what is in the current version you're working with. Another common vulnerability I've seen with iOS is what I call an early day of the new version. Oftentimes when Apple launches a brand new version of iOS, people will try and fuzz iMessage and see what kind of random crazy combination of characters could they use and send to somebody to cause their iPhone to freeze or reboot or something silly like that. Now, Apple's been getting a lot better at this lately, and I've noticed it's normally every second major release of iOS rather than every time a new one came out. But when it does happen, it's quite catastrophic, at least for the users that were relying on their phone not breaking, but can be fixed fairly easily as well. So oftentimes Apple does come out with a patch, usually within 2 weeks of launching a new version of iOS in their, it's normally September the release, I think. Anyway, in their releases, they'll normally have a solution out before Christmas. Another concern we also have with iOS is jailbreaking. Now, jailbreaking an iPhone or an iPad or any other Apple iOS device is where you are essentially taking administrative control of the device and your user session is running with full admin rights all of the time. But why would you do something like this on an iPhone? Well, a few reasons pop up. First one is if your iPhone is carrier locked or network locked, where it is tied to that specific cell provider and it won't work on anyone else's networks. If you jailbreak, you can often undo that setting and make the device work on any cell network, as long as the transceiver works on the bands around it. It'll be fine. But another reason I used to see people jailbreaking their iOS devices quite a lot was back when Apple used to run only regional app stores. Now, for those of you that are in the USA, your app store originally was the best. It had all the apps everybody wanted. And then the other app stores around the world for the different regions may or may not have had those hot top apps everybody wanted. So people would jailbreak their iPhones, their iPads and whatnot so that they could fiddle with their app store settings into using the US app store. And this was actually one of the main reasons people used to jailbreak back in the day. And Apple actually disincentivized that very nicely by allowing people outside of the US to either use their local regional app store or switch through an app store setting that required no admin rights whatsoever to using the international or US app store. And the amount of jailbreak incidences Apple recorded went down quite significantly once that feature became more widely known. Then we have Android. As I already mentioned, one of the main challenges with Android is that the handset vendors are going to customize AOSP quite extensively. This means that you might experience inconsistent updates, as some handset vendors might release security patches for older phones for quite a while, and then some will abandon you. Worse yet, they might never even release an update. They might just move on to the next version on the next handset, which is not great. Also, another challenge you've got to deal with Android and vulnerabilities is that you can very easily sideload APKs. Now, for those of you who aren't Android users, An APK is the actual file that you would want to have so you can manually install an Android app outside of the Google Play Store. All you have to do is just jump around the right settings on the device and disable the security setting that reads something to the effect of block apps from unknown sources. If you turn that setting off, what will happen is you can download an APK from any website and install it, and it should work. Downside is those APKs could have been compromised before you got your hand on it, which is not a great situation. So you might want to maybe limit or block that. Now, you can use something called the Mobile Device Manager, or an MDM, which is kind of like Active Directory, but for smartphones and tablets. And it can deploy policies onto smartphones, tablets, and similar kinds of mobile computing devices. And one of the policies you could do would be preventing users from enabling the ability to install apps outside of the App Store. But what's crazy about the sideloading of APKs on Android is oftentimes you don't need to root the device to do it. Rooting for Android is the same as jailbreaking for iOS. You're taking administrative control. The danger is if any malicious process is on your device, the attacker gets full access, as that's the desired state you want to be in. The attacker will get full access to the device as you're running with an admin account the whole time. Then another common concern is Wi-Fi. So a very dangerous setting that can be encountered for an organization is that a lot of smartphones will often default to using free and open Wi-Fi as soon as they see it to keep the data costs on the cell provider down to a minimum, which is a pretty nice setting. However, there are people out there that will try and take advantage of that and possibly spoof your access point. And another interesting vulnerability that Wi-Fi can have is a cost vulnerability. There is a smart switching setting in a lot of mobile operating systems nowadays that lets your phone hop between Wi-Fi and cellular to maintain a fast connection. Now, this can be a bit of a pain in the backside, as sometimes your phone might think the cell network is way faster and then ignore the Wi-Fi, which might be connected to the much cheaper fixed line internet connection. So be mindful of the Wi-Fi stuff on your mobile device. Then, software vulnerability and cloud vulnerability types. Here we're going to break down some vulnerabilities that appear in various software applications, some big ones that you might want to chat to your developers about. And obviously, because we do like to run apps and other kinds of software on other people's ecosystem and infrastructure, we'll also be tackling some cloud vulnerability aspects as well. So let's start this list out with the top application vulnerability types. So one of the primary ways of trying to attack an application is to try and take advantage of a race condition vulnerability. This is usually where the attacker is trying to race against the clock to affect an application and its order of processing. And as computers work really quickly nowadays, this is getting harder and harder to do. But there are some ways attackers can pull this off, such as a CompTIA attack, or time of check to time of use. So what happens with CompTIA is an application might write some data into RAM and then go off and do something else. While it's away doing something else, the attacker comes along, and however they pull it off, doesn't matter too much, they are able to change the value of the data. The application then comes back and reads that data, and it assumes it is okay because it checked it previously. So one of the things that can help quite a lot with preventing CompTIA attacks is where the application checks and then immediately uses the data. If it has to go off and do something else, it checks it again. Another interesting way of trying to attack an application is also a memory injection attack. This is where the attacker tries their best to inject some content into RAM, similar to what I just described with the CompTIA attack. Except the key difference here is with CompTIA, you're modifying data that's in RAM already. Whereas with memory injection, you're adding new, completely dangerous data and hoping an application will read that and use it. Or invoking a buffer overflow. Now, overflow attacks in general are going to be where the attacker is getting the application and the subsequent system to try and process a value that is either too big or too small for it to be properly stored. Good news, we have 64-bit computers, so we've got really good capability to store large numerical values. And another useful tactic as well that helps prevent attackers from pulling this off successfully is anytime a computer does see it's about to deal with data more than it can actually handle, it can always break the data into chunks and handle them in smaller pieces, limiting the effectiveness of an overflow attack. However, that capability does have to be developed into certain applications depending on the programming language being used. Another nasty tactic as well is a malicious update. If the attacker is somehow able to inject some malicious upgrades and updates into your update infrastructure, this could be quite dangerous. Now, this would usually happen when you are running your own local update server on your network, such as maybe your own Windows Service Update Server, or WSUS server, or your own Linux repository server. The attacker will try and push a malicious application onto that, hoping that all of your clients trust that local repo server. Now, this is not me saying you mustn't use one of those things. What I'm saying here is make sure those servers are kept secure. Otherwise, the update might introduce the malicious vulnerability for the attacker. But this is just general applications. What about web apps and the attacks that can go on them? Some of the popular types of web app attacks are cross-site scripting attacks. Now, there are a couple big ones that you want to be aware of. An injection attack. So what happens with an injection is the attacker compromises the web server and adds their malicious code to the website itself, and then anybody who receives that web page or application embedded in that web page receives the malicious code. This is going to have the greatest impact, obviously, because everybody who now accesses the site is going to have this thing, but it's also the most likely to be discovered as the attacker has gotten onto the thing and made a change, which means they could be leaving an alert or a log of some kind behind for us to discover. Another thing as well that can work pretty well is the customers will probably see something's up and maybe draw the attention of the vendor or the website owner or the web app owner to the unusual behavior. Then you get the reflected attacks, which are a bit stealthier. Here, the attacker asks the web server and the web application for a genuine request, gets a genuine response. The attacker then takes that response they got and adds their malicious executables and script to it. And then what they're hoping to do is see somebody request that same content, and then they're going to try and reply as though they were the web server and try and get that reply back to the victim before the genuine server replies. And they're gambling on the idea that the victim might discard the second reply, the genuine one, thinking it was a mistransmission. And this is more likely to be stealthy and for the attacker to get away with it, but they're not going to have as much impact as they've got to try and get their response off before the genuine server does, which is not as easy as it sounds. Then you get something called cross-site request forgeries. This used to be called XSRF, but they rebranded it CSRF. It rolls off the tongue a little bit easier, trust me. But regardless, it's the same attack still. So in principle, what the attacker is doing is they go from one platform to another via an authenticated trusted user. An example of this would be a website that has one of those remember me checkboxes as you're logging in. When a website has that and the applications therein, you as the person connecting to that site will get an authentication cookie. And then whenever you go back to that site in the future, the site will ask you either, would you like the user to log in, or would you like to pass me the authentication cookie if you have it? Now, obviously, if you have the authentication cookie, you don't even see the login page because your browser presents that straight away. Now, this is where the attack comes in. The attacker sends you a malicious link. You click that link. It takes you to that site, and then in the page extension, they've included a PHP script that triggers a malicious action. So you click the thing. Because of your authentication cookie, you're let straight in, and then the malicious PHP script embedded in the page extension goes and does the nasty thing. The attacker compromised either you or the site owner via the trust you have with that site, hence the cross-site portion of the name. The request forgery, the request came from you, it was a genuine request, but not intended to be there, at least not from your perspective and not from the web server's perspective. Then you get an SQL injection attack. People are trying to call it SQLI or Squilly. I refuse to. I'm sticking with the old name here. But with an SQL injection attack, can get pretty nasty, especially as a lot of databases use SQL, which means very, very consistent vulnerabilities are present. And if I can slip an SQL statement into that backend database, it could be very effective. Now, one of the ways this can be pulled off is by either trying to slip it into a text box that's not being filtered and having text validation taking place, or trying to use a URL to slip in the SQL injection. And sometimes the injection attacks can be really interesting. I remember reading a scenario once where attackers were busy on an online storefront and they did an SQL injection that got the store page to show out of stock items. And then what they would do is they would buy that out of stock item with a credit card. And when the retailer noticed that they were filling an order with an out of stock item, what they would do is they would refund the customer. But the attackers had done it with a credit card. So they would receive their refund from the retailer and then they cancel the credit card transaction, thus reversing it. So they get their money back and the refund. Simple injection. Just show me the database and take advantage of operational processes from there on. Thankfully, though, that type of thing is getting less common nowadays, at least with the big names in online retail. But we also do have to worry about the potential of a cloud-based application attack. So there are a few ways you need to look at this. Mainly, you're worrying about your apps being hosted on a cloud service provider's platform. If you are running your own private cloud, you're in control of the whole show. So that's actually a good thing. However, when you are sharing that infrastructure with somebody else, such as with full-on multi-tenancy hybrid or possibly a community cloud, you need to consider two things about the apps running in the cloud. And that is, first and foremost, any vulnerabilities that might be present within the applications themselves. And obviously you can refer back to normal application vulnerabilities and then just look at the extra layer of but it's running virtual in somebody else's environment. What I always want to get into and what I would always like to know the most about would be the vulnerabilities of the cloud service provider's infrastructure. In other words, what's going on between the applications. That's what I want to know about, because that is where the nasty, really skilled attackers might come in. But there's also another interesting aspect around cloud security and vulnerabilities, and that is also that the cloud could also become a platform for attack. So many years ago, what attackers used to do was they'd go and register a load of free accounts on various cloud service providers' infrastructure. And they'd always make sure that their operations with each of their free accounts were running at the free tier. So they got free computing resources, not a lot, but still quite a reasonable amount. And then they get malicious code running on all of them, coordinated through a command and control server, and they could use that to launch DDoS attacks. Now, to counter that, most of the big names, when it comes to their cloud service offerings, will always ask for credit card information, even if you intend to stick on the free tier only. And the reason why is because that credit card has to be tied to a real identity, which makes it a bit harder for the attackers to create dozens of free accounts for themselves on platforms like Azure or AWS or anything like that. But it still does happen from time to time, so don't write it off entirely. Then we have supply chain attacks. Now, with supply chain attacks, this is normally where something happens to the product, whether it be a piece of hardware or software, before it arrives in your hands. At some point during the point of creation, the point of reception by the ultimate customer, it could have been tampered with. So let's have a look. Development supply chain attacks usually would affect a product being created, or at least being prototyped. So for instance, if I am making a new computer, let's say it's a laptop, I get the hardware from a bunch of different companies. I get the touchpad from one vendor, I get the keyboard from another vendor, I get the screen, etc., from all these different companies. And if any of those companies had a supply chain attack, because I'm further down the line, so do I. The main concern, though, for a lot of people is usually when the distribution infrastructure receives a supply chain attack. So what happens here is the product, whether it be hardware or software, gets intercepted on its way to the customer. Whether that be on the shipping container or at a postal warehouse, it doesn't matter. What you're seeing here is a photograph taken from Edward Snowden's release about the PRISM program. It is apparently, or allegedly should we say, to be safe, NSA agents intercepting Cisco devices and opening the packaging up and loading some things on the devices before repacking and shipping them on. If you guys don't see module 9 from me, you know what happened. Moving along though. You also could experience a maintenance supply chain attack where the spare parts or updates or whatever it is that's meant to be used to maintain the thing is being targeted and attacked. So you might receive initially a perfectly fine and safe product, but a spare part or replacement part or an update to software or firmware might be where the attacker comes in. So that could be fun. Now, when it comes to the hardware supply chain, thankfully this is a little bit easier to try and measure because you've got a physical object that you could look into and understand. How was it created? How did it arrive at me? And how does it get maintained? You can investigate that far more easily. The software supply chain is oftentimes a little bit more obscure, as you don't always have full insight into what the software development practices and publication processes are. But one thing I can guarantee you is that you've got to be really, really paranoid when it comes to software. Yes, I know some websites will show you a MD5 or a SHA hash value when you're downloading an installer. But the thing is, if I'm an attacker who is capable of messing with the installer on a website that you could be downloading from that site, I would probably be able to also mess with the hash value published on that site as well. So always exercise caution, especially when you're direct downloading an application. Now, next up, we're going to have a look at evaluation scopes. Now, evaluation scopes are meant to be outlines of how we go and evaluate or analyze a vulnerability and how we want to interpret it, what type of vulnerabilities we want to deal with, stuff like that. Now, what we normally do is we have targets of evaluation or TOEs. I'm sorry, I'm going to battle to call them TOEs. I always have, but anyway. So the idea of the TOE is it specifically outlines a particular evaluation process you would like to perform. Now, the TOEs will often require rigorous testing and identifying the weaknesses and vulnerabilities that might be present within a given system with the particular methodology and goal you have in mind. Now, the goal is always to mitigate the risks that an organization is being exposed to by vulnerabilities and improve the security posture of the system being inspected by being able to identify the weaknesses and then make recommendations around how to effectively address those weaknesses or vulnerabilities. And also, you might be wanting to do this to help maintain a level of compliance, whether it be a regulatory requirement imposed on you by a government or a prescriptive framework you have opted into following, or an industry regulation maybe. You could be using this as a way to validate your compliance with those standards and outlines, which is always a good idea because the longer you let yourself deviate from compliance, the harder it can sometimes be to bring yourself back into compliance. So let's have a look at some targeted evaluation practices or types of TOEs that we could look at. If you're laughing at what I just said, I don't blame you. It sounds silly. Let's look at a security testing target of evaluation. With security testing, you are looking at conducting vulnerability assessments, penetration tests, and any other kind of assessment to try and find the weaknesses, vulnerabilities, and misconfigurations. A very broad spectrum and intentionally broad spectrum target of evaluation. After that, you might be looking at doing a documentation review. Now, with the documentation review, you're looking at basically running through your design specifications, your plans, your architecture, your network topology, your security policies, your procedures, basically anything paperwork related, and looking for shortcomings in that. Remember, it's not always technology that gets exploited. Sometimes it's the people, and the documentation helps us find those particular attempts. After a documentation review, you want to consider maybe doing a source code analysis. Now, source code analysis, you are usually using some sort of tool to help you out here, or a person, we'll talk about that now, to go through the code and identify any potential security vulnerabilities in the source code itself, or any sort of bugs or errors that could lead to a vulnerability. And hopefully, ironing those things out. Usually common things that are checked for will be things like input validation, secure coding practices being followed, and secure coding standards, trusted libraries, stuff like that. Now, when it comes to doing source code analysis, there are two ways you might want to look at doing this. The first one is what we call static source code analysis, where you have a developer read through the source code. Now, my pro tip here, make sure the developer that reviews the source code was not the one who wrote it. Just like when you try and proofread your own documents that you might write, or your own emails or whatnot, you often don't spot the mistakes and the spelling issues and the grammar issues, especially when spell check doesn't flag them either. Because you wrote the thing, you know what's there, so when you're reviewing it, you don't always read it properly. So a good idea is make sure the developer who's doing the static review did not write the code, and they will read it properly because they're reading to understand and comprehend. Also, helps a bit to make sure that that developer is not part of the team that originally developed the application. The downside, though, of static analysis is it's very time-consuming and effortful, and you are relying on a small number of experts being able to spot those problems. So to get you most of the way there, dynamic analysis might be a bit easier, where you normally use some sort of source code analyzer tool that is available from many of the organizations that publicize and encourage secure coding practices. Then after that, we have configuration assessments. And it is what it sounds like. This is where you run through your config, making sure that it aligns with your best practices, that it fits in with policy, that it actually is helping to uphold a strong level of security. I don't want to ever say perfect, but a strong one would be good. And your controls and the setup of them are in line, difficult to bypass. You get the idea. You can also do a cryptographic analysis as well. With a cryptographic analysis, what you're doing here is you're inspecting the cryptographic solutions you're looking at, understanding which ones are being used and how, the algorithms in question, which is normally the cipher, if you want to use the correct terminology, how the keys are being handled, how they're being secured, and ensuring that the cryptographic solution is properly implemented and not a half-assed job. Then you might do a compliance verification. But with compliance verifications, what you're doing here is you're basically just making sure that everything else is in line with a requirement imposed upon you by either a government or an industry regulator. And this could be worked into most of the other kinds of target evaluation practices you might want to consider implementing. But after that, we have the security architecture review. And here you're reviewing your overall design, not an individual system, the whole organization. So you want to step back here and look at the big picture, how everything's working together. Because it's very, very easy to get lost in the small details and not notice a big weakness or gap in your overall system. And the thing is, that's what the attacker discovers first, because the attacker goes from the big picture to the small. So we want to step back and remind ourselves to look at the network a bit from the outside in and think, how will I get past those things? You don't necessarily have to be able to do it, but it's always a good idea to use that mindset sometimes. Think like the adversary. Could I do this? Yeah, it is within the realms of reason. Yeah, we want to worry about it. That's how that's meant to go down. But now, let's move on to how we are going to go about identifying vulnerabilities. In this section, I'm going to run you through vulnerability scanners and then some other methods that can be used to discover vulnerabilities. And then a little bit later on, we'll talk about how you prioritize and organize your vulnerabilities. So first up, I'm a big believer in getting tools to get you most of the way there. I hate the cliche, but it's an 80-20 principle. This tool can get you 80% of the way there. The remaining 20% of the work might have to be done either manually or with other techniques. But regardless, your vulnerability scanner is a tool that scans the system for vulnerabilities. What more can I say? But it's quite neat in that it can detect a whole host of different types of vulnerabilities, including your operating system's vulnerabilities, application vulnerabilities, configuration vulnerabilities, which I personally love, and sometimes a bit more. Now, key thing to understand about a vulnerability scanner is it is just detecting the presence of a vulnerability, not its exploitability. This means that the scanner might say, there's a vulnerability, but in the way I'm using the thing, the way I've got the thing deployed, it might not actually be a vulnerability. It might just be a quirk of nature. So scanners are not going to help you work out how worried you should be. They just help you identify the vulnerability. And then we use the thing between our ears to figure out whether we do need to worry about it or not. our brains. But let's break down the different characteristics of our vulnerability scanners. There's a whole plethora of products on the market that you can choose from. So what'll be nice is to understand the different aspects of the scanners and up our vulnerability scanning toolbox accordingly. Please be aware you're not limited to only using one scanner type. You can mix and match to get yourself the desired balance you want. So first up, you've got the agent-based scanners. And to contrast them, agentless scanners. So with the agent-based scanner, what happens is you've got an application that sits on the host machine and runs and reports back to the central server that is meant to manage and log all the vulnerabilities. Whereas an agentless scanner is basically going to be an application that normally runs on the server and scans the hosts over the network, asking about vulnerabilities they might have. Now, generally, the agent-based scanner will have more insight into what's going on the machine being scanned, whereas the agentless one is only able to pick up on what's basically available on the network. So it's going to have less insight into what vulnerabilities may be present on the machine. This is not necessarily bad, though, as the agentless one gives you a perspective of the attacker as they're working their way in, whereas the agent-based one's details will be more about what would it be like if the attacker finally got onto the target system. What could they do next? There are some downsides, though. The agent-based scanner is going to be running on the host that it's meant to be scanning, which means it is going to eat up that host's resources a little bit. Oh well. Whereas the agentless one doesn't use the host resources beyond maybe just getting the network card to work with it, which is not too hectic. Now, in general, you'll get more vulnerabilities revealed to you through an agent-based scanner, but not all of them necessarily need to be worried about, because if that vulnerability can't be reached out over a network, the person has to be on the machine locally. It's a little bit harder for them to pull off. Whereas the agentless scanner will normally reveal to you network accessible vulnerabilities, which is obviously going to be a little bit more concerning, as if it can be detected across the network, it can probably be exploited across the network as well. Keyword, probably. Nothing is certain. But besides agent-based and agentless, you also get vulnerability scanners that are either credentialed or non-credentialed. With a credential scanner, what happens is the vulnerability scanner gets its own account that usually has admin rights, whereas a non-credential scanner does not get its own account with admin rights. It runs pretty much as a bog standard application or service account. Now, with a credential scan, you're probably going to be picking up on standard user exploitable vulnerabilities as well as administratively exploitable vulnerabilities. So you're going to get a lot of output with a credential scanner. Whereas a non-credential scanner will reveal only standard user vulnerabilities. But that might be more concerning for you, because if I'm an attacker and I get onto your system, I could try and take advantage of a vulnerability that requires no admin rights or privilege escalation, which makes my attack a lot more successful and more effective earlier on. Whereas a credential scan, if I'm worrying about the administrative credentials, as an attacker, I would have to elevate or escalate my privileges to admin level to be able to touch them. Obviously, we still want to worry about them, but I want to try and get the easy ones out the way first. So standard user vulnerabilities that can be quite impactful would probably be quite high on my priority list. Now, another concern as well is that a credential scanner has an admin account that could potentially be compromised by the attacker. Whereas with a non-credential scanner, no additional administrative accounts or setup needs to be done, so it's less likely to be abused. But don't worry, these aren't the only characteristics we have going here. We also have active versus passive scanners. Now, with an active scanner, whether it's agent-based or agentless, I'm not worrying about the credential thing just yet, but regardless of whether it's agent-based or agentless, an active scanner is running around on the system somehow and looking for host vulnerabilities. So it's basically running around looking at things and poking them with a stick to see what is considered a vulnerability. Whereas a passive scanner just sits back and watches what's executing. Now with active, because it's going around and poking stuff with a stick, metaphorically speaking, it will detect vulnerabilities that are either executable or not in an executable state. So basically it picks up on both kinds. Whereas a passive scanner is able to detect just the vulnerabilities that are busy executing right now. but that might be worth your time to worry about, as those vulnerabilities are more likely to be exploited. Another thing to consider as well with an active scan is that the processing resources required, regardless of whether it's agent-based or agentless, is going to impact your ability to run it regularly, because it does take time for it to complete and give you results. Whereas a passive one, because it's basically a glorified monitoring solution, it's just sitting back there and watching what's plotting, and could probably run 24/7. Then we also have what I call a fixed definition vulnerability scanner and a custom definition vulnerability scanner. These terms are not official, by the way. I'm just slipping this into the course because it's something you want to also look at before you settle on a particular product, especially if you have to pay for it. So with a fixed or single definition vulnerability scanner, usually the scanner only has one source of definitions, whereas the custom one lets you choose different definition sources, which I think is pretty nice. The problem, though, with a single one is because it's a single definition, it's probably going to be a proprietary definition, which can be a bit of a pain to deal with. Whereas usually the scanners that support additional definition sources will allow you to use things like XML, SCAP, or CVE database entries to create a variety of measurement methods for security and stability. But besides your vulnerability scanner, you also want to just take a little bit of information from the outside world. Now, that means we want to do a little bit of intelligence. We want to look at threat feeds. We want to know what are the attackers doing right now. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean I'm going to react to what the attackers are doing. What we're suggesting here, rather, is be conscious of what's going on. And if what the hacking community is doing right now would have a big impact on you, that might be the boost you need to prioritize and push something along. Whereas if the current fashion in the hacking community is not going to affect me and my organization, I stick with my existing priorities. Now, one of the cool things about threat feeds is they can be a continually updating source of emerging threats and vulnerabilities. And with some of the threat feed platforms, they do actually make their threat reports available in SCAP format so that they can be directly imported into a vulnerability scanner, which could be pretty damn neat. However, you do need to do some work after detecting a vulnerability, and we'll talk about that later on. But I'm kind of a fan of open source threat feeds, where the information is being shared freely and availably, with a little bit of analytics applied, which is pretty neat. But usually the good ones, the ones that will probably plug in nicely to a scanner or a SIEM solution or anything that helps automate your cybersecurity, will probably be a proprietary threat feed, which is often basically following a subscription model. I hope for your sake and my sake, when they say per month, it actually is per month, not all 12 months billed in one go, because that always gives me a nasty shock. I'm sure it would do to you as well if you haven't already had that. But we also have some countries where the government is pushing this thing called an ISAC, or Information Sharing and Analysis Centers. Now, not every country has one of these things, but those that do, the information is freely available. If you're not in a country that has an ISAC, that doesn't mean you don't have to look at what is coming from another country's sources of information. One of the things you must remember is that cybersecurity knows no boundaries. It is borderless. And the same attack methodology will work on a business in the United States of America as would work in Argentina and every country in between. So, yeah, no shame, no issue. Even if the information sharing and analysis center is not from your own country, look at it anyway. Might be useful information. You could also use open source intelligence for your threat feeds. Now, there is a difference between open source intelligence and an open source threat feed. An open source threat feed normally has some analytics already being applied and possibly data reformatting to be supported by a protocol like SCAP. Whereas open source intelligence is you going onto the internet and getting the information raw for yourself and then applying the analysis yourself. Search engines, social media, blogs, dark web forums, etc. can all be viable threat feed sources. Wait, the dark web? Oh, hell yeah. The idea of going onto the dark web to get threat intel is not new. But first, let's just make sure we're all clear about what is the dark web. So first of all, you've got the deep web and you've got the dark web. The deep web is simply parts of the internet that is not addressed or accessible via a search engine. So if I were to type in your name followed by your bank and then the word account, I'm not going to get a search result that lets me look at your bank account. When you log in to your internet banking server, once you've passed that login screen, you are technically in the deep web because it's part of the internet that is not accessible via a search engine. And considering I'm using a bank account as an example, that's probably a very good thing. The dark web is just where we take a deep website that is not accessible and easily discovered by a search engine, and we use it for nefarious things. Discussing hacking, sharing tools, selling illegal stuff, you get the idea. Dodgy stuff. Now, usually, a lot of the dark web platforms will require you to access them via an anonymizing internet overlay infrastructure, which is basically just something that runs on top of the internet to allow for anonymization of activity. The Onion Ring network, or the Tor network, very, very popular and widely known. But you also get Freenet and I2P. And a lot of the dark web forums and platforms and stores actually do recognize all the various anonymizing overlay infrastructures, regardless of whether it's Tor, Freenet, or I2P. Now, the goal here is you want to be able to try and get onto some of the forums and the stores. See what is being discussed, see what is being sold. Wait, why would I want to buy dodgy things on the internet from a dark web site? Well, you might be looking at database dumps. You might be looking at a user account dump. There's a whole bunch of things that you could potentially be buying from a dark web store as long as it's the right kind. But always remember, the forums and the stores are for illicit activity. Now, the reason why I bring this up is because there might be law enforcement agents undercover on these platforms, gathering information and hoping to entrap those that are using these services. So you want to be careful what you do and what you say in case someone is watching. I'm not going to use that Michael Jackson song, otherwise I'm going to get a copyright strike, but trust me, the temptation is there. Anyway, problem that we're running into nowadays, though, with the dark web, is a lot of the forums worth getting into are becoming invite-only or verified-only, where you can only be invited into the forum by somebody who's already there and trusted, or you only get access after being verified. And this is making it harder and harder and harder for us to silently observe and learn what's plotting, because we either need to know somebody or we need to go through a verification process. And sometimes that process is hectic. I've heard some absolute horror stories of what people had to do to get onto the dark web forum sites for certain hacking collectives. And it was frankly disgusting and disturbing, and I do not want to talk about it here because, yeah, I don't want to ruin your time and I don't want to make myself unpleasantly nauseated. Let's talk about something a little bit more fun. Penetration testing. With penetration testing, what we're doing here is we're taking a person that knows how to do some hacking and letting them loose on our systems to detect and test the vulnerability. Now, when I say test the vulnerability, I mean they're going to determine how exploitable that vulnerability is, which is really cool because remember what we said earlier about the scanner. The scanner just tells you that there's a vulnerability here. The pen tester can confirm the vulnerability's presence and also show you how it could be used against you. And I think that is very, very valuable to get. Now, the problem though is pen testing costs a lot of time and costs a lot of money because you're going to have to set aside time for the pen testers to meet with you. You want to make sure that you schedule it right so that the pen testers don't cause system overloads, yet still give you valid results. And obviously, these people are really skilled at what they do. And whether you try and employ them full-time or contract them in as and when you need to, it's a pretty penny no matter which way you slice it. So it is something that must be carefully considered. In later videos, we will go into more details about what is involved with pen testing. But for now, I'm just going to give you the bare bones as it relates to vulnerability management. And one of the things you understand are the testing methodologies that they're going to get used. The testing methodologies revolve around the pen tester's knowledge of the vulnerabilities and the implications it has on the rest of the pen test and the potential results. So the three main methodologies are the unknown environment that used to be called the black box test. I'm keeping the old name there just in case you're referring to some older studying material. Now, the whole idea of the unknown environment is that the pen tester knows nothing about the environment and the systems being used, beyond what they are and are not allowed to target, maybe. But as the pen tester gains more ground, more information is revealed to them, simulating the external attacker, whether it be a lone wolf or a collective, it doesn't matter. That is what the unknown environment simulates, the natural discovery and attack process that an attacker would actually be in. But if you don't want to lose time for the pen testers to discover vulnerabilities in a natural way, you could introduce the partially known environment, which used to be known as the gray box test, where you tell the pen testers a little bit about the environment, but not too much. The idea is to give them a head start so that they spend less time discovering and more time testing, which might be more useful to you. Then you get the known environment, formerly known as the white box test. I used to like another one of the old names for this one, which was a full disclosure test, where the pen testers get access to all the information they could need to know about to properly assess and determine what vulnerabilities you may or may not have. And they spend zero time discovering stuff. They're spending more time figuring out how they could exploit the now known vulnerabilities, which means more time getting results and more time doing varied tests rather than waiting and waiting and waiting and waiting and waiting. But I put these three testing methodologies in this particular order for a reason. In case you are going to use the same pen testers for all three, you want to do the unknown first, then the partial, then the full known. That way, the pen tester is not sitting there with forbidden knowledge if you try and do it the other way around. Because if I came and pen tested you, and you let me do the full disclosure known environment first, and then the unknown environment, I will be sitting there in the second test, the unknown test, thinking, how would I discover what I already know about? That is a completely nonsensical question you'd be asking yourself, because you would not be able to tell yourself, oh yes, I would do the following, if you didn't already know the following would give you the result. So that's a pain in the backside. Always do the minimal to most knowledge about the environment. Always work in that order. Then a fairly interesting counterpart or cousin to pen testing are bug bounties. Many of the big tech vendors and companies have public bug bounties where if you discover a security bug of a certain nature in a product of theirs, they will pay you out accordingly to the nature of the vulnerability and how widely affected the customer base may be. And you can get some substantial amounts of money here. I've heard of bug bounties going up to $250,000 for a widespread, severe vulnerability that is fully exploitable on a platform's most widely used tool like a web browser. That is insane. But hey, it's good money and it's somewhat ethical, because the bug bounty program is also encouraging ethical disclosure of the weaknesses and vulnerabilities that could be exploited. So that's pretty neat. But after gathering all this information and getting these reports from either the scanner or your own intelligence process or a pen test, you need to do something with that information. You need to do some analysis and work out how you're going to respond to a vulnerability. So before we get stuck into how to analyze things, always understand when you're using a vulnerability scanner, and I know you're going to use a scanner because it's going to do a lot of the work for you and get you a lot of the way there in terms of discovering and figuring out what you could do about a vulnerability. But you want to understand, how does your scanner get told what is a vulnerability? This could be very useful, because if you understand the benchmark that the scanner uses to say, yes, this is, or no, this is not a vulnerability, it becomes a lot easier to properly make informed decisions about how to respond to what is detected. So I've mentioned this a few times already in this video and previous ones. There is this protocol called SCAP, or the Security Content Automation Protocol. And what it is it's a plugin that is used by loads of scanners and other kinds of security monitoring tools to connect to online feeds for threat and security information. And what's neat is it's quite well secured. The data values are XML derived, and the transmission takes place through HTTPS. So it's pretty robust and secure in that sense. But then where is SCAP getting this information from, though? Well, one of the platforms you want to know about is the National Vulnerability Database. This is a somewhat publicly available database of known vulnerabilities maintained by the National Institute of Standards and Technology in the United States of America. However, what has actually supplanted the NVDs are the Common Vulnerability and Exposure database records, which is maintained by MITRE, which is somewhat government funded. And it's not a bad thing either, by the way, as the information is somewhat freely available. And the CVE entries are really useful, actually. So usually it outlines what the vulnerability is, gives you an overview of exploitability, and then oftentimes there'll be hyperlinks in the CVE database record that allows you to very easily and effectively identify what you could do to resolve the vulnerability, what mitigation options are available to you, basically. But there's one word of warning I need to give you. Do not let the CVE ID number mess with you. A CVE ID number normally reads along the lines of CVE-the year the vulnerability was first discovered, and then another dash, and then usually an arbitrary number for that specific vulnerability. Now, the reason why I emphasized the year of first release is you might have a vulnerability from 2003 popping up right now in your threat feeds, in your results. Don't discredit it just because it says it's from 2003. It could be an old vulnerability with a brand new exploit that has drastically increased the overall risk level many organizations would have. Wait, there's risk levels with these things? Yeah. A lot of these definitional sources, CVEs especially from MITRE, are now using something called the Common Vulnerability Scoring System to try and measure how severe and concerning is a vulnerability. And there's a few things I really dig about CVSS. The arithmetic is not one of those things, though. So it is a free and open standard for measuring vulnerability attributes. MITRE uses it to give an overall threat level, but this is where I really like it. Some of the metrics are open for organizations like yours and mine to apply our own values to, so that we can have vulnerabilities being prioritized, not just with how concerning they are in general, but also how they impact me versus how they impact you. And I really dig that. For that one reason, the crazy mathematics that sometimes involve with doing a decent CVSS score is worthwhile. So, cool. Let's move on to analyzing our vulnerabilities. Now, I want to give you an overview of CVSS just so you can appreciate why this can be a very cool way to measure and gauge stuff. If you want to see a full breakdown of CVSS, that's not going to happen here. This is beyond the scope of the video and the exams I'm preparing you for, namely CompTIA's Security Plus and LPI's Security Essentials. But if you want to go look for yourself further and read up more about this, go for it. Latest version of CVSS at the time of this video recording is version 4. But a lot of organizations are still moving from version 2 to 3. Hey, as long as you're moving forward, I'm not too worried about whether you're keeping pace or not. Now, what happens here is you've got all these metrics. And these metrics get some descriptors added to them, and then some values derived from those descriptors. And then those values, numerical, get plugged into a crazy formula that is meant to give you a vulnerability threat level. So that threat level scoring works like this. As soon as you go to 0.1, you're at a low level vulnerability, up till you hit 4.0. From 4.0 onwards, you're now at a medium level of vulnerabilities. When you hit 7.0 and you start creeping upwards, you're now at a high level of vulnerability until you hit 9.0 up to 10. By the way, it does have decimal values, so you can have like a 5.6, for instance. But as soon as you hit 9 through to 10.0, you are now at critical vulnerability levels. All right, but let's run through these little metrics. They're kind of cool. You've got the attack vector, which describes how the attack is actually performed. You've got the attack complexity, which helps us measure how difficult would it be to pull this attack off. You've got a question that asks, would you need special privileges to pull this off, or could you do this with a standard user? Obviously, if you can do it with a standard user account, that might make this vulnerability a bit more dangerous. The next also would be, would you need to get the user to do something for you? What's the scope of the system? Basically, how widespread is this? How many systems do you have that have this vulnerability? And then there's a metric that comes along from the entity that reports this vulnerability around how would it impact confidentiality? How would this attack impact integrity? How would it impact availability in general? And those base metrics are usually pre-populated. Then you also get the temporal metrics, which I absolutely think is a great idea, because you got what's called the exploit code maturity metric, which is basically a measure of how far along and evolved has the exploitation method become, which also lets you measure your remediation level and how that changes with the evolving threat. And what's your reporting confidence like? Now, there's loads of ways you could look at that. Do you trust your vulnerability scanner? Do you trust your monitoring solutions after you've mitigated a vulnerability to keep you aware of any potential breaches? There's loads of interesting concerns there. But then you get to what a lot of people love, which is the environmental metrics. Now, the environmental metrics are up to you and me and anybody trying to use CVSS to prioritize our stuff. So what you start out with is you can make modifications to some of the base metrics that would be relevant to altering your environment. Like, for instance, in general, a user interaction might be required, but the way you've got your stuff set up, a user interaction is not required. So, yeah, you're basically measuring and adjusting as you need to. And you can also plug in all the base metrics and contextualize them all, because that's the whole idea here. Is you're not taking some random person's score for a vulnerability at face value. You're adjusting it with what matters to you and your organization, what's critical to you, what's priority for you and your organization. And then you also want to add what's your requirements for confidentiality, integrity, and availability on these targeted systems. We're going beyond CVSS. We also have prioritization. You need to work out what matters to you and your organization. Now, this does not mean you get to go backpacking across the Far East to find yourself. What we're encouraging you here is to use the intelligence sources to work out what's going on right now, to take your vulnerability scanner reports and see what you have, and then contrast that with your internal criticality. Basically, what you're trying to do is take that outside information that you've got and balance it with an analysis of how your organization operates and what is critical to you. That way, you know, ooh, this matters to us, we better solve it now. Because even if it's a low threat vulnerability for most people, for my organization, it could be catastrophically dangerous. It all depends on the circumstances. And you could have two competing organizations a kilometer apart, and they might have completely different things going on inside despite being so close, both in the sector they operate and also geographically. So internal criticality will even vary when you go from one employer type to another, even in the same country, hell, even in the same street. You never know. And once you've done that, you can start classifying your vulnerabilities according to, is it an OS? Is it an application? Is it cloud? Is it a network? What is it? What kind of vulnerability is it? And the reason why you want to do this classification is just so that you're going to have a more obvious way to approach what type of problems you need to bring solutions to the table for. And also to make it clear that certain IT experts will be brought in based on their fine-tuned knowledge. Then you're obviously going to measure your own exposure factor, which is how many of your systems have this vulnerability. How severe is that vulnerability for you? If this vulnerability were to be targeted, what could the resulting effect be? Yeah, it sounds kind of hectic, and it is. So, things you want to care about for the exposure factor: number of assets, number of users, and number of customers. Those are some pretty common exposure factors. But you know what? If you've got some other ones you want to use, go for it. Just whatever you do. Anytime you start changing up certain variables used in these calculations, please, please, please try and keep them consistent so that you have an apples with apples comparison. And then impact. What kind of damage can the attack cause? That's always worth understanding. And this is also quite fun because you could lab this out, get a pen tester involved, and see what kind of damage could be wrought to your systems if a serious attacker were to come along and start causing havoc. But always remember this: your organizations do accept a certain amount of risk. As an organization, regardless of whether you're for profit or not, government or private sector, doesn't matter. You have a goal to operate. That goal may or may not require some degree of risk to be taken on. But every choice, every operation has a risk. And security is not about risk elimination. It's about risk management. We're trying to get risk down to minimal levels here. And this is what vulnerabilities help us with. We can resolve those risks, or we can decide at what point are we okay with those vulnerabilities. Is it because it's really unlikely? Is it because maybe damage caused would be minimal? What is the risk tolerance like? And understand where the threshold for that is. Now, before you get all carried away with trying out different ways of interpreting and understanding stuff and doing research and learning cool things, whenever you're looking at reports from a vulnerability scanner or any kind of vulnerability analysis task, there are two things to always bear in mind. False positives, which you've probably heard of before. Because a false positive is when the tools that are meant to alert you to stuff alert you to something that is not really a concern. Now, I'm not going to be too upset about false positives because, honestly, as a security person, I would prefer it if my system draws my attention to the goings on and falsely label them as malicious than to assume it's all a-okay. It's better to rather have that false positive sometimes. What you really don't want are false negatives. False negatives are where the system should have drawn your attention to something, but it didn't. And here's the problem: you don't know what you don't know. And that can be quite a difficult thing to deal with. So usually what we would want is the false negatives at as close to zero as humanly possible. And then the false positives we don't mind dealing with because, hey, if that means I could have the false negatives down to zero, sounds like a good deal to me. But always remember that whenever you're looking at a vulnerability or responding to a SIEM alert or something like that, is this a false positive or not? So that you don't waste your time and effort. Now, a very good idea is also to corroborate any information you get from a vulnerability scanner. Anything that does the work for you, try and corroborate it, or at least correlate it, with manual detection and analytics, just to support your belief in the tool and also validate the weird going on that might be more easily dealt with. Now, once you have spent time looking into a vulnerability, understanding its nature, seeing what could be done about it, so forth, you now need to start thinking about what type of responses and remediation approaches are you going to consider. You might not have the authority to implement the response and remediation process, in which case then you would probably be putting together a report that would be given along to the appropriate authorities that would then allocate the resources to appropriately handle and remediate vulnerabilities. So let's run through the remediation options. Patches are always a great idea. I know that mindset of, I do an update, it fixes one problem and gives me another 3. That does happen sometimes. But usually that's because the hotfix was rushed to the market and didn't go through as much quality control testing as it could have or should have. And yeah. But usually a future update sorts that out for you. So as long as you keep yourself up to date, you're in an okay position. Plus, it is the lesser of two evils. As much as I hate choosing between two evils, sometimes you have to choose the lesser of. And the reason why keeping yourself up to date is the lesser of the two evils is by choosing not to do updates. You're saying, I'm okay with all the current and future vulnerabilities to ever be discovered, which means your system's exploitability just grows with time. Whereas the person who keeps themselves up to date, even if they do get some weird problems from time to time, is not going to have to spend as much time bringing stuff up to date and is going to come into problems and issues that need to be resolved before going any further. So, yeah, the patching works nicely. Then reconfiguration. Reconfiguration will be redoing the settings. Common cause for vulnerability issues is bad settings applied. If we apply the correct ones, we can often get around and resolve most of those headaches. But for the pure security professional in me, I would like to remove things if I can. If the stuff is not absolutely needed, either directly or indirectly, you could consider removing it. That will help drastically decrease the vulnerability and make the system that little bit more secure. Another thing, of course, to be considered is also getting cybersecurity insurance. Yeah, you get it. Where you can pay a brokerage and underwriter to keep your data safe in the event of a complete data loss, disaster taking place. Now, key thing is the insurance entity is normally going to require that you do your due diligence. It's like if you get car insurance. Just because you got car insurance doesn't mean you can drive like a maniac, crashing into whatever you want. Because if you do, your insurance company ain't going to be happy with you and start charging you more if you're making too many claims. However, your car insurance might be a little bit more forgiving with you financially if you drive responsibly, safely, carefully, in which case they might lower the overall price of cybersecurity insurance. But don't bank on it, please. That pun was not completely intended. Because no matter how much money you get paid out from cybersecurity insurance payments, you are not going to get a guarantee that it would bring your data back. It's not like I can pop down to the corner shop and buy my database again. If it's lost forever. So that's why you want to do the insurance, but don't think it's going to solve all your headaches. Another interesting remediation approach is maybe you realize the need for better or more network segmentation to isolate vulnerabilities in the network, and then use firewall rules and stuff like that to limit or block those kinds of activities to those parts of the network. It is a very clever idea, as it does allows a little bit more ease of creating customized security approaches for different departments. And then compensating controls, which I'm a big believer of. Making sure that if solution A doesn't work out, if it breaks or the attacker finds a way around it, whatever, there's a solution B. And if that one fails, there's a solution C. You get the idea. I like to have contingency, compensating controls. So that if one thing goes wrong, I've got that catching my backside, but I've also got something else ready to catch it. Only downside is developing a robust and sophisticated solution for compensating controls can be very expensive and time consuming. And that might discourage the employer from actually pursuing it. But that's beside the point. It's always a good idea to have a variety of solutions, and ideally some that are very cheap to implement that you don't mind having to maybe even pay for yourself. Not that I encourage that, but try and have cheap options where you can. And also remember, you're going to get exceptional circumstances. Case in point, legacy. Are you going to update a legacy system? With what patch? The vendor's not releasing anymore. Are you going to remove it? Well, that's the whole goal of legacy, is that you can remove it in the long term, but in the short term, it's got to stay. Could you segment it? I'd hope you already have. You get the idea. You might want to make it an exception. Now, when you make it an exception, remember one thing. You can also often mark it as an exemption or an exception or something similarly worded in Vulnerability Scanner, so that when it generates reports and stuff like that, it doesn't keep reporting on the same thing. But do watch out, because if the scanner updates in any way or gets reconfigured in any way, it might stop recognizing the exceptions to the rules we created. So be mindful of that. Now, another important thing as well is validation, both of your detected vulnerabilities and obviously your final implementation. And one of the best ways to validate vulnerabilities, whether it be part of initial detection or after your mitigation, remediation, whatever term you want to use, is to rescan stuff. Now, the idea of rescanning is if you do the scan twice for detection and both give you a result, the result's probably true. But one of the things I would suggest, if you're doing validation before and after a vulnerability response or mitigations process, is to ensure that the definitions of any scanning tools you use are not updated when you're doing your measurement after some security improvements. Because I've seen situations where a vulnerability assessment was done this week, cool, 1,000 vulnerabilities, fantastic. Team gets cracking on them. Then this time next week, another vulnerability scan is done, but this time the definitions are up to date. Suddenly you got more than 1,000 vulnerabilities. It felt like you made no progress. In fact, it felt like you went backwards. So when you're doing validation of deployments, you obviously do your reporting before, do your improvements, and then rescan with the same definitions to see if it brought some of the vulnerabilities down. It's always a good idea to do that. Another thing that's also quite useful to validate that your vulnerability remediation is working is auditing. A lot of frameworks and regulatory compliance obligations are going to expect you to be compliant with certain industry standards, and they are going to want to make sure of that, so they will send auditors. Auditors should not be feared. The only time you should ever fear an auditor is when you are not doing things the way you are meant to be doing them, and now it's rush, 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 hustle, hustle, hustle to get everything in order. Whereas if you were concerned about auditability and compliance from day one, and when I say compliance, I mean regular compliance inspections, you wouldn't be panicking about an audit. I have worked in one place in my life. I'm not going to tell you, obviously, because I don't want to embarrass them. I mean, hiring me is an embarrassment as it is, but anyway. Where the audits were superb, to the point where the auditors would come along, external auditors, obviously, and they'd say, hey, we need this data. Here you go. We need access to this thing. Give me a moment. But otherwise, we just carried on with our ordinary day because we made sure we were always regulatorily compliant. And any deviation from it was immediately rectified. Another good thing to do as well is verification of your vulnerabilities. Just because something is considered a vulnerability doesn't mean it's a vulnerability for you. Also, if you handle that vulnerability outside of the scanner's ability to detect it, like maybe you implemented a firewall rule to block the network access for a network exploitable service, your scanner might not detect that. So always verify your results as much as you can with things like pen testing or any other kind of exercise, like maybe some amateur ethical hacking in a lab environment. But rather build up some confidence before you think about doing that. And then finally, report generation. That's another option. A lot of the tools we use to help streamline our vulnerability management can generate very nice reports for us. They can obviously be presented to the decision makers and the higher ups, but also it's great for us as well, because we can see some details about how things were going. So the report generation process is pretty awesome. But that is all I have for you in this video. So here we just laid the foundation for vulnerability management. Believe you me, I could build entire courses around every single thing when it comes to vulnerabilities and how to manage them. And even if I did, I probably wouldn't cover every scenario that exists. And half of you would at least come to me and say, hey, what about this? Hey, what about this? Hey, what about this? And I can't handle every possible thing, every possible vulnerability, and every possible way to handle it. But that's not the point of this series or the exams that I'm trying to prepare you for. The point of those is to lay solid foundation to build upon in the future as needed. Otherwise, I would like to thank you all for watching this. If you have not already subscribed, please do so. If you've got any friends, family members, or co-workers that are into this type of thing, developing some cybersecurity knowledge, don't be afraid to share it with them. Otherwise, I will catch you all in the next video.